Hi, folks. It's Mr. Majewski here, and I'm going to be finishing up the religion review today. I'm going to finish it up with coverage of a series of religious conflicts. We're going to look at some historical religious conflicts, and we're also going to look at some present day or modern day ones as well. These are going to include conflicts between religions, also conflicts between government or secular groups, and religious groups as well. We'll get into the definitions of all those, but first we're going to finish up with the last couple of slides from the Religion Review PowerPoint. We left off with Sikhism. I kind of was in a hurry there at the end of the last review, so I'm going to start there actually this time around. Again, Sikhism is a newer faith. It's a newer religion. It developed in India. It is technically strongest in India, although it is a universalizing faith and it exists, it's distributed around the world. Sikhism is considered to be a syncretic religion in that it's a blend. It's a mixture of Hinduism, Buddhism, with a little elements of Islam as well. They do believe in one supreme God. Obviously, that is a Islamic belief, an Islamic tradition. However, they do believe in reincarnation. They also believe in karma. All right, so again, some emphasis from Hinduism, some blending in from Buddhism as well. The idea with Sikhism is that you should revere God, you should be very religious, you should also be very committed to hard work, serving humanity. There are many Sikhs who serve in the military, for instance. You should share with one another. The interesting thing about Sikhs is that they believe the leader, the spiritual leader, the guru, exists. And the guru, when one guru dies, a new guru is chosen by their kind of being to be the religious leader, to be the head of their organization. I believe there's been 10 gurus so far. Again, when this person dies or passes away, then of course a new one will be replaced. They have no formal priesthood. Gurus, again, are kind of chosen. All right, they have some sort of message or spiritual message that identifies them as the chosen one. Sikhs usually worship at home, similar to Hindus, where there's no public religious gathering place. Oftentimes there are shrines or religious areas within the home that are worshipped or venerated. Again, hymns, prayers. The holy book is called the Holy Granth. Again, it's considered more mainstream monotheistic religion based on ethical behavior, along with strong religious beliefs or following of the Granth. Its followers live all over, but again, located in parts of India primarily. Anyways, a new example of a modern and mainstream universalizing faith. Okay, now we change directions, all right, and we acknowledge, hey, religion is a powerful belief in many people's lives and their cultural traditions and customs, and so therefore, oftentimes a lot of conflict can be generated as a result of religion or religious beliefs. A lot of tensions can sometimes emerge. Religious conflicts can oftentimes be bitter dividers of groups of people, even within the same country. It can lead to warfare. It can lead to warfare even between branches of the same religion. It can lead to groups being targeted by governments or by the dominant mainstream religion in a place. Let's also realize there are cults that exist. Cults are groups that claim to be a part of a religion, but they deny basic truths of that religion or religious beliefs that the rest of the religion just accepts as mainstream. And they'll deny a basic one. For instance, again, many Christian cults don't necessarily maybe believe Christ was the sole Messiah. Maybe they believe their leader, their person, has a connection with God and actually is a prophet or the actual Messiah or voice of God. That's an example of how a cult might deny a basic mainstream concept within the Christian faith, for instance. A couple of other things. Interfaith boundaries are boundaries that separate two religions. For instance, in Pakistan and India, the boundary between Pakistan and India, I told you, it's kind of a language boundary, an isogloss, so it's sort of a religious boundary. And when they decided where that boundary would be, they looked at what languages were being spoken, and then they divided it religiously as well to try to keep the major groups, the Hindus, I should say, on one side in India, and of course the Muslims on the Pakistani side. Greece and Turkey have done the same For instance, in Cyprus, they've divided that island up along language and sometimes religious boundaries as well. The Greek Cypriots, oftentimes Orthodox. The Turks are Islamic, and so the island has been kind of carved, I should say. There's a line in an official boundary called the Green Line that exists to kind of keep the peace, because there were a number of terrorist attacks by Turkish groups against the Greek Cypriot government. There's many areas of conflict. We're going to get into that next. The most common, or the most well-known, is obviously the Israeli and Palestine area. That's been historically an area of conflict. It's an area of conflict all the way up today between Israel and the surrounding Middle Eastern states, of course, whom are primarily Islamic, and both of those groups would like to control this land because of its extreme importance to their religions. Please also understand we have intra-faith boundaries. Inter means between two different. Intra means within. So we're talking about boundaries that exist within the same religion, but boundaries that separate branches or denominations. For instance, in Europe, there are intra-faith boundaries that separate the areas of the continent where the Protestant faith is dominant versus the Catholic branch versus the Orthodox Christian branches of Christianity. They're all part of the same religion. They divide up within branches, and so the map recognizes those divisions. Those are intra-faith boundaries. Very different. When we divide up the Sunnis and the Shiites around the world, those are intra-faith. When we divide up Islam versus Christian, different religions altogether, that's interfaith. We got some wonderful maps here. Looking forward on slide 43, they show you the difference there. Interfaith boundaries that exist between, Islam and, of course, Christianity. And then intra-faith are boundaries that exist within the same, branches. Alrighty, like for instance, the map of the United States, which of course we are going to look at when we come back from our winter break. Of course, Shia and Sunni Muslims have intra-faith boundaries as well. Of course, this recognizes the fact that oftentimes branches or denominations within the same religion might not get along. They might not agree. They might have religious differences, sometimes even conflicts. Of course, folks, it's now time that we probably acknowledge that a lot of times religion can lead to what we call fundamentalism. Fundamentalism is where religion is so fundamental, it is so important to you, that ultimately you believe religion and your religious beliefs ought to be one of the fundamental or primary ways that you live your life and that your government is run. So it's where you believe that religion and your religion ought to influence or maybe be the primary influence of your government. A lot of times in the United States, there are, for instance, Christian fundamentalists who would like to see the United States follow a more Christian tradition, maybe implement laws that reflect their biblical beliefs. Of course, the issue over abortion oftentimes has become religious, involving religious groups versus those who are generally not as religious, who don't identify as religious groups, who perhaps are more pro-choice in the issue. Fundamentalism that is really taken to an extreme, and usually extreme means violence. That's known, of course, as extremism or religious extremism. Groups that take action, and when I mean action, I mean harsh action. Action that the majority, the masses, would disapprove of. Those are called extremists or religious extremists. Oftentimes maybe bombings or terror in the name of their religion. If they're trying to overthrow the government, if they're trying to scare or cause a rival religion or a rival group to maybe run away, to flee, or even worse, to disappear because, they get rid of them. All of those are considered examples of religious extremism. Extremism is fundamentalism taken to the next level, taken to an extreme, a violent level. Of course, the terror attacks around the world, for instance, the most famous probably 9/11, the attack on the Twin Towers. That's religious extremism, where these fundamentalists from these small groups throughout the Middle East decided that they were going to attack the United States because they believed the United States, a secular country, was dominating them and their religious beliefs. Again, fundamentalism taken to an extreme, extremism, which leads to violence, conflict, war, genocide, these horrible, horrible effects. We have a number of different articles that we are going to read when we come back, related to specific examples of, religious extremism between groups, by a group against a government. We also have examples of governments persecuting particular groups. We're going to read some of these, and I think these are going to be really clear to us, the differences between, secularism, extremism, fundamentalism, sectarianism, which is the opposite of secularism. It's where you fight for your sect or your religion against secularists. Anyways, we're going to look at some of these articles, including, for instance, the government in Mali giving lashes, with whips to certain groups, to certain individuals. For instance, Barbie dolls being banned in certain Islamic countries like Iran because it's viewed as, it's viewed as secular. Barbie is. She's viewed as non-religious. She's viewed as affront to some of the religious rules, customs where women in that country are covered. So, for instance, she's been banned. So small examples like that are technically examples of religious conflict, maybe not violent religious conflict, but they do still exist in nearly every country around the world, including the United States. We're going to go through this list, actually, of various tensions between religions in the next about 10 minutes. And I'm going to kind of cover these very briefly so that, remember, if you get questions about religious conflict, you can describe it, you can define it, and you'll have a laundry list of examples, both historic and current, that you might be able to use in your FRQ or in your response. Now, hey, my recommendation is learn one or two of these. Learn and kind of remember one or two of these. So again, you could recite them, you could recall them if needed on the particular AP test question. Okay. Historically, tensions between religions. Well, Islam and Christianity. The big primary area of conflict between Islam and Christianity has been the Middle East. It's been the area today that is Israel. Previously, this was known as Palestine. It's where Jerusalem, the capital of Israel, is located. The Europeans, for hundreds of years, from about 600 to about 1200 AD, launched a series of what they called crusades, where they launched military efforts to try to go down and capture the Holy Land and claim it for Christianity. Ultimately, they were successful some of the time, they were unsuccessful others. So what happened was Jerusalem and this Holy Land, Judea, Palestine, which is today Israel, fell into the hands of originally the Jews, of course, and then it fell into the hands of the Christians, Muslims, back and forth, until ultimately the Muslims controlled it from about 14 to 1500 on. Anyways, hundreds of years of war. These were known as the Crusades, as both sides wrestled back and forth over control. And each would occupy this land back and forth. And when they occupied it, they would build their buildings there, their holy sites. That's why, again, in this area, particularly Jerusalem, we have all of these religious buildings from these organizations practically built on top of one another. In addition to that, there were conflicts between Islam and Christianity in Europe. In fact, the Muslims invaded Europe. They took most of southern and eastern Europe at various times in the 14 and 1500s. Greece, the Ottoman area, what I should say, Yugoslavia, or Serbia, Bosnia, those areas, those were all controlled by Muslim countries. That's why many of them actually have large Muslim populations today in what we call the Balkan Peninsula. Also, the Muslims actually controlled Spain. They came up from North Africa into Spain, controlled much of Spain during this time as well. Ultimately, they were defeated. They were pushed back out of Europe. And again, Europe was dominated by Christians. We also have conflict between Catholics and Protestants as well. When the Protestant Reformation happened, when the Protestant church broke away from the Catholics, there were a series of what they called Protestant wars from 1500 to 1900. This was usually wars between southern European countries and northern European countries. The Catholic countries were in the south. The Protestant countries were in the north. Ultimately, both sides won some of these. There were tons of conflict, particularly in Germany, and also in Scandinavia, also in Austria, between both sides. Ultimately, these died down in the 1900s. However, there is still some, unofficial tension that might exist between these groups. Christianity and Judaism. Okay, well, historically, when the Jews were forced out of the Middle East, many of them went to Europe. oftentimes in Europe, particularly in southern and eastern Europe, they were pushed into certain neighborhoods. These neighborhoods were known as ghettos, where they were forced to live together and isolated from the rest of the community. In addition to that, in Russia, in the 1800s, early 1900s, Jews were actually targeted. They were forced to work in some camps. These camps and ghettos were known as pogroms, where, again, they were kind of targeted, removed, isolated from society. Ultimately, these are examples of Christian countries, many of them Orthodox countries, targeting Jews, worried about the influence these Jews were having religiously. The big conflict, again, that I already mentioned, but is going on still today, Islam versus Christianity versus Judaism in the Middle East, in Israel. Again, there are groups that exist from all three sides that live in this small area, confined area. They all have very particular sacred sites, holy relics, hugely important religious architecture and buildings there. They all would like this land for themselves. They all live really almost like clustered together, almost on top of one another. This conflict is a hot conflict. What I mean is it heats up oftentimes. There's a lot of tension. The Israeli military oftentimes gets into conflict with Palestinian protesters, rebel groups, terrorist groups as well. Also, we've got a conflict that has occurred historically between the Shiites and the Sunni Muslims over who's the rightful leaders of the faith. The most recent conflict was in the 80s and 90s. Iran and Iraq fought a series of wars that were devastating to both countries. Iran is again a Shiite country, the largest Shiite country in the world. Iraq, of course, is Sunni, and the conflict was primarily religious. Again, in Bosnia in the 1990s, there were conflicts between Serbia and Serbians who lived in Bosnia, who are primarily Orthodox Christian. Also between the Croats, who are predominantly Catholic, and also between Muslims who lived in Bosnia. There were a series of genocides by the Orthodox Serbians against the Bosnian Muslims. Ultimately, there were a series of wars. Eventually, the United States and the United Nations got involved to keep the peace. All of those historic tensions that have existed because of religion. And then tensions between the government and particular religious groups. You know, there were anti-Catholic policies against Catholic groups in the United States in the 18 and 1900s, trying to reduce the number of Catholics that came into the country, not allow them to vote or run for political office to reduce their influence. We've had the same thing in Canada, particularly by the English Canadians against the French Catholics in the East, in Quebec. In China, in communist China, the Buddhists and Buddhist monks were oftentimes targeted because they led government protests against communism. Remember, communist governments view religion as a threat to their control. The government controls your mind, doesn't control your mind, but is your number one loyalty in communist government, or that's the way the communist government would like it, where you're more loyal to the government than anybody else. And so if a religion is around, the government views that as a particular threat. So Buddhists were targeted by the communist government in China. Buddhists actually led the protest against the Vietnam War in Southeast Asia. Some of them actually lit themselves on fire in protest of American entry in Vietnam. Catholics and Orthodox leaders led the resistance to communism in the Soviet Union in the 1920s through the 1990s as well. So oftentimes religion was a major opposition to communist governments, and therefore communist governments targeted religious leaders, religious groups. Stalin purged thousands of them, for instance. Of course, the Jews with Nazi Germany as well, a very, very famous historic example of a government targeting a particular religious group. We've also had tensions between religions in modern day as well, and I think it's important that we mention a few of these briefly, although we will cover them in class when we come back from break. There are conflicts between Islam and Christianity going on today in Nigeria and sub-Saharan Africa. There are Muslim groups, there are Christian groups, extremists that would like to see the government be more loyal to their faith. We also see Muslim groups attacking Christians in places like Sudan, South Sudan, throughout sub-Saharan Africa. The Israel-Palestine conflict is heating up as we speak. In the Middle East, it is still ongoing. There are conflicts that are happening over the last couple of months. Also, we have tensions today in Europe between Muslims and governments. Also, Afghanistan, Qatar.